they build ice and so forth. One, if you see the building now, there's one window there. There was a building was next to it, and the police one night went into the building on the corner and took a ladder and went into the musicians club and raided it. You know, they called it well. But the next day they took it, bricked up that window. See?
Just to make it not easy.
Would that be what they
Somewhat, yes. In those days, in order, for a long, long time, there was a lot of clubs, private clubs, and what we call after-hours clubs. And like one day, there on Clinton Street across from the window, there was a place that was very, very popular called the Republican Club. And in order, and the Musicians Club as well, that in order to come to the Musicians Club, you had to come as a guest. And even when they had the free jam sessions that were on Tuesdays and Sundays, when you came up, you had to sign the book because they had to have a guest because of the state law. Otherwise, they couldn't have the risk. Many of the members, in order to keep membership, they had glasses with their names on it. And we have a lot of these glasses with names on. But that's what it was, and that was to get around. Even though now gambling and all the rest was not a part, was illegal, and you couldn't do it in a private club. And many of the after-hours just to do that, and that's how they got created.
So you've heard a little bit about the COC. You've heard some of the lasting things it's had with. At least indirectly, with how that has been the oldest, still continuing one of the first black, we came from one of the first black unions. I would like to hear, especially from Mr. Scott as president, and Mr. Bauer as jazz historian, what you think Buffalo's contribution to swing jazz has been, and maybe some famous or notable musicians who come out of Buffalo.
Well, if you look back in those early years, Buffalo was probably the 8th largest city in the country back then because of the industry, because of the lake and everything. A lot of materials were shipped in and shipped out from Buffalo to the west and the south. But it was also one of the major stops for all these famous musicians that we talk about. And because of that, when they came into Buffalo, they got to come to the club and maybe have a drink and sit with some of the local guys. And they heard these guys play, and in some cases, they got asked to join these bands, and they went on the road with some of these famous people. And because of that, they became famous or notable because of being discovered by these famous musicians coming in and out of town. And I would say the same would be true with, with the dancing. As, a style was developed one location and it comes into Buffalo, and people see that, they pick that up, and then they run with it throughout Buffalo and vice versa. If there was a style that was really unique here, it went to all the other towns because everybody kept coming back around and around and around. So, everybody really knew each other on a first name basis or a nickname or whatever. That's how it was.
No, I've just been listening to you guys. Very, very good presentation. I can give you an era from a different perspective because obviously I was not a member of the Color Musicians Club. When I joined the local, I knew about the Color Musicians Club, but when I joined, I looked up American Federation of Musicians. Oh, okay, local 40. I called them and I said, now what about this black club? Oh no, you can't join that. They said, you're white, right? No, they said you can't join that. So, to tell you the truth, I would love to. But I was 17. I did what these old guys told me. So I joined the union in about 1965. And so other than playing for about 3 months with Al Tinney, which you guys both I always played with the older white musicians. Since I was a kid, and I enjoyed the older style. My father had played in the 20s and the 30s. I grew up with all his records in the house, and I used to watch Betty Boop on the first TV on the street. And if you watch those Betty Boop cartoons, Max Fleischer was unreal. He was a producer. He had Louis Armstrong, Don Redman. He had all kinds of great bands inserted in those cartoons. Those are great adult cartoons. Betty Boop was a sex pot. And so I grew up with that stuff. I liked more modern styles of bebop, but I always liked the foot tapping fun of jazz because I have a big sense of humor. So I started playing with all these guys who had played in the 20s, 30s, 40s with various bands. Joe DiTullio on the drums, Andy Shemaine, trombone player. John Sinola, of course. And these guys had toured in the 30s and 40s. And a lot of musicians, when they came through Buffalo, black and white, they liked the communities of a small, very black. And a lot of the Italian players either came originally from Buffalo or came through Buffalo, and they liked the Italian-American community, which is mostly in the West Side. And that's another interesting thing, is that the first musicians, the first white musicians who could really assimilate jazz well were almost all Italian-American or Jewish-American. Because if you listen to the peasant music that they listened to when they were kids growing up in the east side of New York or maybe over in the old country, you listen to Sicilian, especially peasant music, and you listen to the Jewish club band, you go, wow, it wouldn't take much more than make that jazz. These guys knew that music, they could play it, and when they heard the better end of jazz by about 1917, 18, 19, when it was still more of a ragtime form, they listened to that and they could play it. Benny Goodman, Jewish. Artie Shaw, Jewish. Manny Klein, trumpet player, Jewish. All these guys were Jewish. And then you had a lot of Italian players who came from New Orleans, from New York, both had big Italian communities. Some of the first white jazz players were Italian in New Orleans. And they were the ones who got recorded because sadly the recording studios would not record black musicians until about 1920. Black Swan records with Black Home, and they would record the black players. My father played the white tradition in the 20s was very little jazz. You had a couple of great solo players, Jimmy Dorsey on the saxophone, clarinet, legendary Vic Spiderbeck and cornet. But the white players, really good jazz was an exception. It was a little more of the dance orchestra sound. It was more of a written form. If they improvised, it was still a rather stiff style because they never curved, other than if they lived near the Mississippi where the riverboats went up and down the Blackfeet. You never really heard good jazz. If you came from some little Midwestern town or Syracuse or somewhere, you didn't hear much of it. And it wasn't on the radio because the radio stations didn't want to play anything that was too offensive or jazzy. It would be like Little Richard in 1957, when my brother would aggravate my father by blasting because to somebody who grew up in that 20s, 30s, 40s era, Little Richard would be, I don't know what, like pet banger music today? Kill your parents, kill your parents. Yeah. So the radio stations wouldn't play anything very offensive. A few exceptions to Gene Goldhead Orchestra. He was a French concert pianist who realized he wasn't going to make it as a concert pianist. So he came to America, organized, a very good businessman, he hired the best white jazz players he could find, mixed by Joe Rudy on the violin, who I had the pleasure to play with. He was still a good player. Eddie Lang, the first real jazz guitarist. A number of other players, Steve Brown, who really originated the jazz bass style. These formed the Gene Volkett Orchestra in Detroit. They would broadcast out of Detroit, and if you had a good radio with a 100-foot antenna running around your backyard, you could pick these guys up. And for a lot of white folks who had only exposure to popular music with records or on radio, Gene Volkett Orchestra really swung. In fact, a lot of the black musicians who really helped the history of jazz and forever said, you know, that was the only white band that really swung really hard. And in this was 26, 27, 28, Paul Whiteman, who had a huge amount of money, just hired those guys on the boat campaign. And the Whiteman Orchestra was very big, kind of cumbersome, but we still let these guys do their hot solos. So the Whiteman records later are still quite interesting. My father used to play the Crystal Beach Ballroom. Even the real straight dance orchestras. My father played opposite Rudy Valley's band. Rudy Valley was the first big radio movie crooner teenage idol. In 1929, he got very big. He had one really hot tenor saxophone player. Other than Bud Freeman, there was no other white tenor saxophone player who was any good at jazz. This tenor was generally a section instrument. 2 altos, 1 tenor. The tenor would play the low harmony and really big solos. Well, this guy's name was Joe Miller, and Rudy, on his earlier records, before he got really commercial, would allow Joe Miller to take some really fine solos, so that was my collection. There was Donhauser Park in Lancaster, and these are white-only dance halls. Unfortunately, folks were arrested to try to get in. Yeah. And there were huge theaters downtown, vaudeville theaters, and there would always be usually a fairly commercial band that did a lot of funny stuff on the stage. If you can ever look at excerpts from early talking films, like Syncopation, it's on YouTube, 1920, it's one of the very first talking musicals. You'll see Waring's Pennsylvanians. And you go, oh, Fred Waring and the Pennsylvanians, the big choral group. Well, he had a fairly jazzy white dance orchestra, and they all did funny stuff.